Please welcome Bill Thompson.
Okay, firstly, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. It's again, a great honor. I feel like I'm repeating what other people have said, but when I first started my PhD, Lola Cuddy was very interested, had done a lot of work on tonality, and we had a lot of discussions, and one of the first papers that she asked me to read was the 1982 Krumhansl and Kessler paper, which I read about a dozen times, with great concentration. First time understanding 10%, then 15, and it went up from there. And in fact, I think that the challenges that I had just fully understanding, I was quite young at the time, ends up being important, as I'll describe in my talk later. And it's sort of the kind of disfluency that one gets when one's trying to understand something in detail, and you go slowly, and you end up having a kind of deep understanding and appreciation for what you're digesting. And Carol has become, a really great friend since then, and was one of the external examiners on my thesis, and as is Lola Cuddy, of course, a great friend. And so I thought I'd start by talking about another friend of mine who I've known virtually all my life, so we're getting to be a half a century good friends. His name is Mark Antliff, depicted there. He's an art historian at Duke University, and we became friends early in life and have remained really close friends ever since, and that's to a large extent because of our common interest in artworks, art and music. And yet, when we discuss our scholarly interests, it's a case of one of us listening with interest, as though visiting a kind of interesting city. We're not really exactly doing the same thing. So, although our research concerns the same issues, our fields seem almost incommensurable at best, and at worst, in conflict. Psychologists look for general principles, and art historians reject them. But with this in mind, I'd like to discuss the possibility of using tonality as a kind of a jumping off point, the possibility of bridging music perception and cognition with historical approaches to art appreciation, whereby artworks are conceived with attention to musicians, artists, and the circumstances in which they create artworks. The basic argument I'll make is that all appreciators represent artworks in three ways. They represent the artwork structurally, they represent the source of the artwork, and this can be factual knowledge, such as an art historian, or could be superstitious beliefs about the source of the music, but it's something about the source. And they represent the artwork in a personal manner, which is episodic representation. And I'll also argue that these three types of representations vary in salience, prominence, depending on how we process the stimulus. In a sense, they compete for our attention. The representations are probably supported by perceptual, semantic, and episodic systems, but in making my argument, I prefer to discuss them in terms of structure, source knowledge, and personal experience. And I'm going to focus on tonality as a fundamental structural representation of Western music, because that's the work that I've done mainly, but it's taken for granted that it's not the only way in which musical structure is represented, and my arguments can easily be applied to other structural representations of music. So let's start with the mental representations of tonal structure, which Carol explored extensively with perceptual judgments in a tonal context, and which influenced my early work and continues to influence my work to this day. So I did a series of studies with Lola Cuddy and some other colleagues, and Lola and I explored some of the detailed characteristics of this mental representation. My earliest interest was whether combining individual voices gave rise to emergent aspects of tonal structure, or whether the tonalities implied by each individual voice could predict the perceived tonal structure when those voices were combined. So that's my earliest interest. I'm sort of doing just snapshots of some selected work, but one of the things that Lola and I showed is that tonal pitch space has asymmetric properties. Across a range of exemplars, we examined how listeners experience tonal structure following changes in keys. And we observed a kind of gravitational pull back to the original key for movement in one direction, but not the other. So the method involved playing sequences that involved a key change, obtaining probe tone ratings for all possible tones in the chromatic scale, and then using mathematical techniques to determine where on the toroidal map of keys the key change left the listeners. Did the key change shift listeners' sense of structure all the way to the new key on the map, or only part way? And the key changes that we focused on looked at the most prominent dimension of key relationships, the cycle of fifths, where keys whose tonic notes are separated by a fifths interval are adjacent on the map. And we found that movement in a clockwise direction left listeners only partway towards the new key. The presence of the initial key lingered more strongly after the key change than the reverse direction. So this wasn't true. Movement in the counterclockwise direction left listeners close to the newly established position. And the influence of the initial key was actually minimal for the excerpts that we used. So I'll just play you an example of one of the excerpts. They're short, so. An example of the kind of probe tone. So this just shows that the representation might have asymmetric properties. Although the reasons for this are actually unknown, there are a few theories for it. For example, Charles Rosen argued a long time ago that overtone series might create an asymmetry in the cycle of fifths because the second overtone of any note implicates movement to the fifth above that note, and by extrapolation, the second overtone of the tonic note of a key might implicate key movement to the dominant. There are other music theories, for example, by Wirtz, that explains this asymmetry as well, but basically it's somewhat unknown. In another study, we looked at what happens when there are competing tonalities in music. For example, when we hear polytonal music, in this case bitonal music. And this figure shows that probe tone ratings can be very well predicted by a weighted sum of the tonal hierarchies of the two component keys of bitonal music. So both keys do seem to have some influence on our perception of structure. This is a piece by Dubois. Okay. However, when we looked closely at what was happening, we looked at what happened in the left hand, what happened in the right hand, doing probe tone studies of each, and then when they're combined, we found that the full bitonal piece was close to the key of the lower register, nowhere near the probe tone profile for the upper stave alone. So the overall sense of tonal structure seemed to be dominated by the harmonic accompaniment played in the lower pitch register. Apparently, when there was a melody and accompaniment with competing tonalities, listeners perceive the melody as somehow extraneous to the key-defining texture of the music. And this suggests that when conflicting tonalities are combined, we derive our sense of tonality from mainly from the harmonic accompaniment in the lower pitch register and interpret the melodic structure in a manner that's not well modeled by tonal structure. That's a very special case where you have bitonal music where they're competing tonalities simultaneously. And then in an ongoing study that we're conducting right now, so I can't really give you very many results, we're looking to see whether structural representations can be uncovered in brain responses to stimuli. So we're using whole head MEG to see if and when representational structure emerges across the first 1,000 milliseconds of brain responses to musical pitch. So basically, just to explain the technique, it involves presenting various stimuli and tracking MEG responses for each, and then we use discriminant analysis to obtain a measure of how different the brain responses are for each stimulus pair. It's called decodability, and then we perform multidimensional scaling on the resultant distance matrix or decodability matrix, and then we can also test hypotheses or models at each point in time. So for example, the initial study that we're conducting, we're looking at MEG responses for individual pitches, and we're testing the helical model of pitch. The top left graph, the first one, actually just shows the maximum decodability across all stimulus pairs for the first 350 milliseconds. And the other graphs show the results from various models of structure represented on the right-hand side. So the models are these ones over here. Color-coded from blue to yellow. So the first model is pitch distance. It's the second graph here. And the predicted distance is 0 for pitches that are identical. So you've got pitches down here like C1, C sharp, D, and so forth, and then C1, C sharp, D along here as well. And so the diagonal is the decodability of a pitch with itself. And obviously it's predicted to be not decodable. They can't be separated. So the distance is 0, and that's represented in blue. And as pitch distance increases, you get increased predicted distance. So that's just a very simple model. And then here it shows the Meg responses, and when they start to become, it starts to model this, it starts to fit well with the Meg responses over time. This one is octave equivalence, and it's only octave equivalence, so it just shows these diagonal cases where pitches are separated by an octave, and there's really nothing much happening here. So this is early. We've only got about 6 subjects. We really need about 35, so I'm not making too much of it, but right now, we're not seeing in the first 350 milliseconds at least much about octave equivalence. This model is actually saying that every note in the first octave is the same and every note in the second octave is the same. So it's a very strange model, but in fact, it actually has, there's something going on there. So, we're really in exploratory mode with this, but we're looking to see what's happening. And what we want to do eventually is to see if representational geometry that Carol uncovered with perceptual data can maybe be uncovered from electrophysiological responses to those same stimuli. So we ultimately may be looking at pitch in a tonal context. But instead of talking about that line of work, I'd like to turn to a parallel program of work that I've been doing for a long time on our perceptions and knowledge of musicians themselves, and how this knowledge affects our experiences of music. In a series of studies, we've shown that attending to the characteristics of musicians influences us at several levels of appreciation, from how we encode and represent musical structure, to emotional interpretations of music, to evaluations of the aesthetic quality of music performances. And this attention to what I would call source may be motivated by the fact that it assists with the formation of an accurate representation of the stimulus, what I would call structure. So in other words, people turn to examinations of the source in order to support their perceptions of regularities in the stimulus, because it can really help. So at a perceptual level, for example, this just gives you a snapshot of some of the studies that we've done. Facial expressions of performers can communicate information about phonetic information, about pitch distance, tonality, closure, dissonance, and emotion. And this is work done with Frank Russo, especially, Carolyn Palmer, and others. I think this is what we argue in some of these papers, is that the facial expressions, because it tells you a lot about music, not just emotion and not about the person, but actually about the music itself, that it's especially useful when perceptual fluency is reduced, when you're having difficulty. So for example, listening to music in a noisy environment, or listening to music that is just a little hard to digest, maybe because you don't have the perceptual capacity to understand everything about the music. You look to people. It's a form of lip reading. Okay, and this is something that's sort of important. So just to give you an example, Frank and I presented participants with silent video recordings of musicians singing melodic intervals of different sizes, and we asked perceivers to judge the size of the melodic interval they imagined the musicians were singing. So even without any sound, as interval size increased, the judged size of the interval increased, indicating that perceivers can read structural information right off the face of musicians. So we can attend to source knowledge whenever we want to supplement our perception of structure. So I'll just give you an example of what it looks like. You can see a lot of things happening in the face. It's pretty easy to tell. And in another study, which we never published, but we should follow up at some point, we showed that some singers seem to map tonal structure onto facial expressions, such that listeners can read information about the tonal hierarchy based on the facial expressions. Again, same paradigm. We presented silent video recordings to participants and asked them to judge the stability of the note they imagined the musician was singing. So I'll give you an example of this. So you can read things from a musician's face if they're expressive. If they're, opera trained and they're just very, stilted, you're not going to read it. But what we found was that it varies from singer to singer, but expressive singers, you can read it. Now, going back a long way, this is my postdoc working with Manfred Clynes, which was an experience, and it was, in this case, I introduced different expressive timing patterns thought to be typical for performances of music by three composers, Beethoven, Haydn, and Mozart. So these composer-specific patterns were proposed by Manfred. The validity of his ideas is not really important here, but what I want to highlight is that in the judgments I obtained, there was a dissociation between judgments of musicality, an aesthetic judgment, and judgments of the appropriateness of these expressive timing patterns for the composer. So our musically trained participants seem to agree with Clynes in this case that his Beethoven pulse, a kind of timing pattern that you occur across a kind of metrical structure, was in fact the most appropriate of the three pulses when performing a piece by Beethoven, but it didn't sound as musical overall as using a different timing pattern. So the musically trained listeners have source information about the composer that can actually be distinguished from what they like on an aesthetic level. And finally, Gary McPherson and I worked together during a sabbatical one year on a model of performance adjudication, and we focused a lot on biases in the adjudication process. And some of the most significant biases relate to knowledge or beliefs about the performers themselves. For example, performances believed to be produced by a student are given significantly lower evaluations than performances believed to be produced by professional performers, even when labels of student and professional are arbitrary and counterbalanced. And conversely, artworks believed to be produced by a child prodigy are interpreted differently than the same artworks believed to be produced by adults. And an example of this is the case of Marla Olmsted. I don't know if any of you remember this, but she was born in the year 2000 in Bingham, New York, and by age 4 she'd attracted international attention, thought to be the next Picasso, and her abstract art was selling for tens of thousands of US dollars. The family had made over $300,000 from her art. However, when Ellen Winner went on 60 Minutes to just sort of look at this and give her commentary, she actually concluded that the girl was being coached by her parents and was pretty much a normal 4-year-old. And at that point, art collectors concluded they'd been duped. Sales plummeted. They completely, dropped the Olmsteds, and her work was no longer valued. And it just shows that, knowledge of the source is really important to how we appreciate and value that artwork. And so that brings me to my tripartite model that has structural representation as one layer of appreciation, and we can appreciate things on a structural level, and we can study it for our entire careers. But source representation is another way in which we appreciate artworks. And that's more semantic knowledge. It's knowledge-based, or it can be imaginative. So it doesn't have to be, you don't have to get training as an art historian or musicologist to have source representations. It can be done at the level of looking at performers and paying attention to them as they're performing, or it can be more conceptual. And then, of course, personal representation. I'm not going to talk about that, but that's really important. So, for example, work on music and dementia. Lola Cuddy has done a lot of work on that. Many of you in the audience have done that. Carol has done work on reminiscence bumps, which I think is really interesting. So, there's this other kind of personal representation that's also important for our appreciation of artworks. But we've got these three types of representations. And my argument is that they're always present in all of us. We always have access to them, but we focus on different ones depending on the circumstance. Now, there are many factors, but one factor that I think is important, and it's partly influenced by the fact that fluency theory is now really gaining in a lot of traction because people are finding out a lot about fluency, is that when you have high fluency, it can be accommodated, it can be assimilated into our representations. So how readily stimulus characteristics are stimulated into an existing schemata will influence the relative prominence of these representations. When individuals easily assimilate sensory input, well, they incorporate the experience into an existing framework, and the motivation to consider non-structural aspects of the stimulus is reduced. If you can hear the music perfectly well, why look at the face? You don't need to. Okay, you've got high fluency. When you've got low fluency, you start to look to other aspects, to other representations. So when stimulus attributes are distinctive, not easily assimilated or expected, then a process is triggered whereby non-structural representations are consulted. Okay, and this is accommodation, to use sort of Piagetian term. It's the mechanism by which violations of expectation lead to learning. When stimulus characteristics are difficult to assimilate, we consult source representations in order to assist in our representation of the stimulus, and we do this at multiple levels of abstraction, from attending to the facial expressions of musicians as part of perceptual experience to accessing source knowledge as part of conceptual understanding. So how do we study this? Well, one prediction is that when music is distinctive, so does not readily fit into our generic schema of music, well, there's going to be greater evidence for source representations of music. And a related idea is that disfluent sounds trigger more abstract thinking. Okay, it's not just the immediate perceptual experience, but more abstract thinking. And there was a finding that came out about 3 weeks ago, I think, a study by Hansen and Meltzler. I don't know if any of you heard of that. And they found that participants exposed to music that featured a dissonant tritone processed subsequent information, I think it was shopping lists or something like that, in a more abstract way than participants exposed to music that focused on the consonant perfect fifth. And they also applied fluency theory for this, so that when you have disfluent information, you tend to look beyond the immediate experience to something more abstract. It's interesting that just like David Huron not having glasses until he was, about 18, my friend Mark Antliff's the same thing. It was really quite late in life, and you have to wonder whether, there's something about that disfluency that actually caused him sort of think a little bit more abstractly because he couldn't see what was in front of him. Anyway, another way of there are different ways of conceptualizing, and I'm just sort of throwing up brainstorming ideas, but, is to imagine a kind of radius of creativity with generic ideas occupying the central area and distinctive ideas occupying more eccentric areas. And as music becomes more eccentric, we're less able to rely on generic representations and more likely to consult source knowledge. Putting it more simply, you're not going to know who the composer is if you're just hearing a cadence. As it becomes more distinctive from generic representations, you start to get something that's more idiosyncratic and indicative of the source knowledge. So you're better able to access it because you've got more information, and I think you're motivated to as well. So you've got these two things. So with respect to tonality, we can test these ideas as an example from looking at changes in the salience of tonal representations and source representations, even as a piece unfolds. Or you can take fragments. So this is just an idea that you could use a key tracking algorithm. This is one that soon after my thesis, I developed a model to track the movement of musical keys. Later models did a lot better jobs and were much more extensive. For example, David Huron developed a kind of tonal salience model much like this. But this calculates the correlation between events in music and standard tonal hierarchies in a moving window, and you can trace the dynamic flow of tonality as a piece unfolds, showing points where the music aligns well with tonal structure, other points where the music is more weakly tonal, exhibiting a kind of tension, although it's only one type of tension, as we'll find out in the next talk by Carol. But this index of key salience is derived from this model. There may be other models. But what we could do here is, using this kind of algorithm, we could examine excerpts that are either tonally fluent or non-fluent. We could take fragments of the non-fluent parts of music and then examine the salience of the different representations. So we'd need to establish a set of stimuli for which all three representations are in place. So you would have the structural, you'd have the source knowledge, and you'd have the personal. So it might be popular songs, for example, and then devise a way of evaluating the prominence of structure, source, and personal representations. So this is still something that is in development, that I'm working with Nicholas Bullough in Sydney with, and we're looking at this kind of thing to do as a next step. And I have to acknowledge some of the people that contributed to discussions. These are just Nicholas Bullough, who wrote an article a little while ago looking at historical thinking in artworks. Stephen Davies, who we had a workshop and we had a lot of discussions. Thomas Carlson, who is doing the representational geometry with John Sutton, who's a philosopher of cognition, who I've talked a lot to. And then, of course, my longtime friend, Mark Antliff, who, we're trying to still bridge those different roads. Thank you very much.